Okay, so, hmm, let's get rid of that. Okay, sorry about that. Oh, okay, I apologize. Part two. Let's see. First of all, we want to know who explored, and we can get into so first we'll take a look at it with nations. And the very first we're going to say Portugal, Spain, and they were in the 14 and 1500s. Then we have the other three, the Netherlands, England, and France. And they got off to sort of a late start. We're really looking at them at the late 1500s and 1600s, which is really the heyday of colonization and exploration and so forth. So we can list all sorts of people associated with all the countries. We have Adrian Block, and we have Henry Hudson, and I already mentioned De Soto and Magellan, and Bartholomew Diaz, and Francisco Pizarro. Well, he was more of a conqueror, so I won't put that. But Francis Drake. So there's boatloads of these guys, and they're fun to study, and you'll probably end up doing that in your classes to some extent very shortly. So we studied the nations that explored, but also the people that explored. And we can get to that a little more of that a little bit later. So then the question becomes, well, what happened when they arrived? And this was a world-changing event. And so the big thing that happened was this thing called the Columbian Exchange, which your kids have already been taught in 3rd grade. So we're going to try to draw upon their knowledge of that. The Columbian Exchange, which is the exchange of goods and ideas between Europe and the Americas. And so this is a really, really big and profound deal. So let's see. Food was exchanged, and namely the potato, but hundreds of other crops from the Americas. Europe didn't have a ton to offer. Well, we'll get there. I should say, I'm going to get rid of that and say vegetables. Mostly the vegetables came from the New World to the Old World, and I'll get to that in a second. So vegetables. Then we have animals, and mostly the domesticated animals actually were not really in the Americas, but were in Europe. So this is a big deal for cattle, pigs, horses, goats, and that's going to bring up something a little bit later called disease. But I suppose technically Native Americans could have benefited from some of these animals, particularly the horse, but the other ones, I would argue, not so much. Medicine. The plants, the Native Americans knew the plants, shared them with Europe, and that has to do with population. So there's staggering figures on this. It's something like 2,000 new medicines arrived in Europe or something like that. Something really, really profound, and we'll get the statistics shortly. Metal. So this was one good thing for the Native Americans. because metal was so much more durable than some of the naturally occurring materials that the natives were using. Okay, and then of course there were other things that were exchanged and that changed society, like this is a big one, is beliefs. Boy, let's see. So native religion, generally speaking, had gone decreased, because we'll get to that in a second. And European religion changed. And this is one of the most fun ones for me, is that in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, but in the year 1517, Catholicism splits. And this is called the Protestant Reformation, which is a really big deal. And, well, why did Catholicism split in 1517? Only 25 years after Columbus, and it's pretty well established there's a connection between the two. And the problem was, for a lot of Christians, is they were like, well, what about Noah's Ark? I thought everybody was supposed to arrive on Mount Ararat on Noah's Ark, and that's in Turkey. So how did all these people get over here? They started challenging the Bible. And then another one is, well, what about heaven and hell? Everybody in Europe could go to heaven and hell, but what about the Indians? They had never even heard of Jesus to believe in him, so how could they be doomed to hell? That didn't make much sense. And there were other aspects, so ways of that the new world that challenged the thinking of the old. And so, some of this challenging contributed to the split in Christianity. Oh, I shouldn't say Catholicism, it should say really Christianity splits between Protestants and Catholics. So that's fascinating. Another one is politics. And the native tribes had far more equality and far more democracy than the monarchies of Europe. And so people noticed this. And there was far more equalities between the sexes. So there was matriarchal societies, like Champasha was the sachem for the Hammonasset Indians, and she was the one who sold Guilford their land and Brantford their land and so forth. So that's fascinating. I think the roots of democracy are, there's a legitimate claim can be made that roots of democracy were found in the native tribes on a number of levels, and I've had students write research papers on that. Another one is disease. This was not good for Native Americans. All significant diseases passed from Europe to the Americas, and that's primarily because Europeans were living so closely with their animals. Their animals were living in the basements or the bottom of their houses, and they were living in the top of the houses, because animals actually provide a huge amount of heat. It's staggering and so they were living with these filthy animals, and diseases were developing. And so we have bubonic plague, we have cholera, we have smallpox. And in the end, it's really commonly accepted that 9 out of every 10 Native Americans died of disease, which is just impossible to recover from. It cannot be overestimated how devastating that was to the Native psyche. Like when we're talking about why Native religious beliefs decreased, they were like, why are we all dying and the Europeans are not? Interestingly, and a bit of humor, the one disease that seemed to pass from Native Americans to Europeans, syphilis, and that spread, good thing I don't know how to spell syphilis, and that spread like wildfire through Europe, but was small potatoes compared to what was happening in the Americas. So really, it was quite simple, relatively simple for Europeans to conquer the Native Americans when they had faced this absolute massive decimation in population. But meanwhile, the population of Europe was booming. And why is that? Well, all those medicines, all that new food. So it's really a sort of a tragedy of how well Europe made out in this Columbian exchange. We're going to stop there and move on.